The fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead, casting a sterile glow across the rows of cubicles. It was past 7, and most of my coworkers had already left for the day, their chairs pushed in neatly, their desks cleared of clutter. I sat alone at mine, staring blankly at the spreadsheet on my laptop screen. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, but no words came. The numbers blurred together, meaningless symbols swimming in front of me as my mind wandered elsewhere. Work had always been an escape, a place where I could bury myself in tasks and deadlines, avoiding the gnawing sense of dissatisfaction that followed me home each night. But lately, even that refuge felt hollow. Maybe it was the weight of another birthday passing without anything significant changing in my life. Or maybe it was the quiet realization that I'd spent years chasing someone else's idea of success instead of figuring out what truly made me happy. Whatever it was, it lingered like a shadow, heavy and unshakable, that I sighed and leaned back in my chair, rubbing my temples. That's when I heard his voice, low, smooth, and unmistakably commanding. Still here. My heart skipped a beat before I turned to see him standing there. Alexander Kane, the CEO of the company, looked every bit as imposing as he did in the photos plastered across business magazines. He wore a tailored navy suit that fit him like a second skin, its crisp lines accentuating his broad shoulders and lean frame. His dark hair was perfectly styled, though a few strands fell rebelliously across his forehead, giving him an almost boyish charm. But it was his eyes that caught me off guard, the way they seemed to pierce through everything, seeing far more than anyone else cared to notice. "Yeah," I replied, trying to sound casual despite the sudden tightness in my chest. "Just finishing up some reports." He nodded slowly, his gaze lingering on me just long enough to make me uncomfortable, and yet not entirely unpleasantly so. "You've been working late a lot lately," he said, his tone thoughtful. "Everything okay?" The question caught me off guard. No one asked about my well-being anymore. Not really. Not since my parents stopped calling every week. Not since my friends grew tired of hearing me say I was fine when I clearly wasn't. And certainly not from someone like Alexander, who lived in a world so far removed from mine that it might as well have been another planet. Still, something about the way he asked made me believe he genuinely wanted to know. "I'm fine," I said automatically, forcing a smile. Just trying to stay ahead of things. He didn't respond right away. And for a moment, we simply stood there, the silence between us charged with an energy I couldn't quite name. Finally, he broke it with a soft chuckle. "Well, don't work yourself too hard. Even machines need rest." His words were light, almost teasing, but there was an undercurrent to them, a flicker of concern, or perhaps curiosity, that stayed with me long after he walked away. I watched him retreat down the hallway, his footsteps echoing faintly against the polished floor. When he disappeared into his office, I exhaled a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. Tea wasn't the first time Alexander had noticed me. Over the past few months, our paths had crossed more often than usual, at meetings, in the elevator, once even in the break room when I was grabbing coffee. Each encounter left me feeling unsettled in ways I couldn't explain. There was something magnetic about him, something that drew me in despite my best efforts to keep my distance. Maybe it was the confidence he exuded, or the way he carried himself with such effortless grace. Or maybe it was the tiny moments of vulnerability I occasionally glimpsed beneath his polished exterior, the brief flash of exhaustion in his eyes during a late-night strategy session, or the way his voice softened when he talked about his younger sister. Whatever it was, it unnerved me, because along with the attraction came a flood of questions I wasn't ready to face. What did it mean to feel this pull towards someone like him? Someone who existed in a sphere of power and privilege I could barely comprehend? Someone who likely wouldn't give me a second thought outside of these fleeting interactions? And yet, here I was, still sitting at my desk hours after everyone else had gone home, replaying our conversation in my head and wondering if I'd imagined the subtle shift in his tone when he'd asked if I was okay. By the time I finally packed up and headed for the exit, the building was eerily quiet. The hum of computers and printers had faded, replaced by the faint creak of the air conditioning system. As I passed Alexander's office, I hesitated, glancing inside. The door was slightly ajar, and through the gap, I could see him seated behind his desk, his head bent over a stack of papers. A soft glow from his desk lamp illuminated his features, highlighting the sharp angles of his jawline and the faint stubble along his chin. For reasons I couldn't articulate, I found myself lingering there, watching him. In that moment, he looked less like the untouchable billionaire CEO and more like a man carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. It was a side of him I doubted many people ever saw, and for reasons I didn't fully understand, it made my chest ache. Reluctantly, I tore my gaze away and continued toward the elevator. By the time I stepped outside, the cool night air hit me like a shock, snapping me out of my thoughts. The city stretched out before me, its skyline glittering with promise and possibility. But as I walked to my car, one thought kept circling in my mind. Why did Alexander Kane care whether I was okay? And why did I care so much about the answer? The next morning, I arrived at the office early, hoping to get a head start on the day's tasks before the usual chaos descended. The elevator ride up was quiet, just me and the faint hum of machinery. When the doors slid open on my floor, I stepped out and nearly collided with Alexander. He was standing right there, coffee cup in hand, looking as though he'd been waiting for the elevator himself. His eyes widened slightly in surprise, and for a moment, neither of us moved. Then he smiled, a small, almost imperceptible curve of his lips that somehow managed to feel both warm and guarded at the same time. "Good morning," he said, his voice smooth and steady. "You're here early." "Yeah," I replied, shifting uncomfortably under his gaze. "Trying to beat the rush." He nodded, taking a sip of his coffee. "Smart move. This place gets hectic once everyone shows up." There was a pause, and then he added, almost casually, "You left pretty late last night. Did you manage to finish those reports?" The question caught me off guard again. It wasn't unusual for a CEO to check in on employees' progress, but something about the way he phrased it, his tone soft, almost intimate, made it feel less like a professional inquiry and more like genuine interest. "I did," I said quickly, clutching my bag tighter to my chest. "They're all submitted now." "Good." He glanced down the hallway toward my desk, then back at me. "Listen, I wanted to talk to you about something. Do you have a minute?" My stomach flipped. "Talk to me? About what?" My mind raced through possibilities, none of them particularly comforting. Had I made a mistake in one of the reports? Was this about my performance? Or worse, had someone noticed how flustered I got around him and decided to say something? Sure, I managed to choke out, following him into his office. The space was exactly as I'd imagined it. Sleek, minimalist, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking view of the city skyline. A large mahogany desk dominated the room, its surface immaculately organized save for a single framed photo turned slightly away from view. I wondered who was in the picture, but didn't dare ask. Alexander gestured for me to sit in one of the chairs opposite his desk, then settled into his own seat. For a moment, he simply looked at me, his expression unreadable. Finally, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "I've been reviewing some of the recent projects," he began, his voice measured, "and I wanted to commend you on your work. You've been doing an excellent job, especially considering the tight deadlines we've had lately." Relief washed over me, followed immediately by confusion. Praise from Alexander Kane? That wasn't something I'd ever expected. "Thank you," I murmured, unsure of what else to say. He tilted his head slightly, studying me with those piercing eyes. "But I also wanted to ask if everything's really okay. You seemed distracted recently. Not that it's affecting your performance," he added quickly, "but I'd be lying if I said I hadn't noticed." His words hung in the air between us, heavy with unspoken meaning. Part of me wanted to brush it off, to tell him I was fine and leave it at that. But another part, the part that had spent years burying my feelings and pretending everything was okay, felt a strange urge to confide in him. Maybe it was the sincerity in his voice, or the fact that no one had asked me that question in so long. Whatever it was, I found myself hesitating. "It's nothing major," I said finally, choosing my words carefully. "Just life stuff, you know. Sometimes it feels like I'm stuck in this endless cycle of work and obligations, and I don't know how to break free." As soon as the words left my mouth, I regretted them. They sounded pathetic, whiny even. Who was I to complain about my problems to someone like him? Someone who probably had assistants to handle every minor inconvenience in his life. To my surprise, Alexander didn't dismiss me. Instead, he nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "I know the feeling," he said quietly, "more than you might think." His admission took me aback. Somehow, I'd always assumed people like Alexander were immune to doubt and uncertainty. Seeing him acknowledge his own struggles felt oddly comforting and terrifying all at once. Before I could respond, his phone buzzed on the desk, breaking the spell. He glanced at it briefly, then sighed. "I'm sorry, I have a call in 5 minutes." But he hesitated, his gaze locking onto mine. "If you ever want to talk, not as your boss, but just as someone who understands, I'm here." The offer lingered in the air, unexpected and loaded with implications I wasn't ready to unpack. I nodded mutely, standing up and mumbling something about getting back to work. As I left his office, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between us, something subtle yet undeniable. Over the next few days, I tried to convince myself that the encounter meant nothing. It was just a conversation, I told myself. A brief moment of kindness from a man who probably forgot about it the second I walked out the door. And yet, I couldn't stop thinking about it. About him, that IT didn't help, that our paths continued to cross more frequently than usual. Whether it was passing each other in the hallway, sharing awkward smiles during meetings, or finding ourselves alone in the break room while everyone else was at lunch, felt like fate, or maybe coincidence, was determined to keep throwing us together. Each interaction left me more confused than the last. My emotions tangled in a web of attraction, insecurity, and fear. One afternoon, I found myself lingering outside his office again, watching as he worked behind his desk. He must have sensed my presence, because he looked up suddenly, catching me staring. Instead of looking annoyed or amused, as I'd feared he might, he simply raised an eyebrow and gestured for me to come in. "You seem to have a habit of lurking outside my door," he said, a teasing note in his voice. "Is there something you need?" "No," I blurted out, my cheeks flushing. "I mean, yes. Sort of." He chuckled softly, leaning back in his chair. "Well, which is it?" I hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. "I guess I just wanted to thank you. For the other day. For listening, I mean." His smile softened, losing its teasing edge. "You don't have to thank me for that. Like I said, I understand what it's like to feel overwhelmed. Sometimes it helps to know you're not alone." His words struck a chord deep within me, resonating in ways I hadn't anticipated. In that moment, I realized how isolated I'd been, not just from others, but from myself. All these years, I'd convinced myself that keeping my distance was safer, easier. But now, standing there in front of Alexander, I wondered if maybe I'd been wrong. Still, doubts lingered. What did he see in me? Why did he care? And most importantly, what would happen if I let myself believe, even for a second, that this connection between us was real? The days turned into weeks, and our interactions became less formal, more natural. It started with small things, Alexander stopping by my desk to ask how a project was going, or me lingering in his office longer than necessary after delivering reports. At first, I told myself it was harmless, just two colleagues building a rapport. But the truth was harder to ignore. Every conversation left me craving the next point one evening. As the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky in hues of orange and purple, I found myself working late again. The office was quiet, save for the faint hum of the air conditioning and the rhythmic tapping of my keyboard. I didn't hear him approach until his shadow fell across my desk. "You're here again," Alexander said, his tone teasing but tinged with concern. He held 2 cups of coffee, one extended toward me. "I thought you might need this." I looked up, startled, and took the cup gratefully. "Thanks." I didn't realize how late it had gotten. He leaned against the edge of my desk, sipping his own coffee. His suit jacket was draped over one arm, his sleeves rolled up to reveal strong forearms dusted with dark hair. For once, he wasn't perfectly put together, and it made him seem more human, more approachable. "You know," he said after a moment, "you don't have to burn yourself out for this job. You're already doing great work." His words were simple, but they hit me harder than any compliment ever had. No one, not even my closest friends, had acknowledged my efforts so genuinely. I felt a lump rise in my throat and quickly looked down at my screen, pretending to focus on something important. It's not just about the job, I admitted softly, surprising myself. Sometimes it's easier to stay busy than to think too much. He didn't respond right away, and when I glanced up, I saw him studying me intently. There was no judgment in his gaze, only understanding. I get that, he said finally, but running from your thoughts doesn't make them go away. Trust me, I've tried. His honesty caught me off guard. In that moment, I realized how little I actually knew about him beyond the polished exterior. Was he lonely too? Did he carry burdens he never let anyone see? We talked for what felt like hours, though it was probably closer to 20 minutes. He shared stories about growing up in a family where expectations were high and failure wasn't an option, about the pressure to live up to a legacy that sometimes felt suffocating. And I listened, captivated not just by his words, but by the vulnerability in his voice. When he finally stood to leave, he hesitated, his hand brushing mine as he reached for his jacket. It was accidental, or maybe it wasn't, but the brief contact sent a jolt through me, sharp and electric. Our eyes met, and for a split second, I thought he might say something. Instead, he smiled softly and walked away, leaving me breathless and confused. The next day, he invited me to join him for lunch. Not in the cafeteria, surrounded by curious glances and whispered gossip, but outside the office entirely. We went to a small cafe tucked away in a quiet corner of the city, its walls lined with bookshelves and its tables scattered with mismatched chairs. The atmosphere was cozy, intimate, and completely unlike anything I'd expected from him. As we sat across from each other, sharing plates of food and trading stories, I began to see a side of Alexander the First hadn't known existed. He laughed easily, his deep chuckle sending warmth spreading through my chest. He asked thoughtful questions, genuinely interested in my answers. And when he spoke about his passions, his love for photography, his dream of traveling the world, I could see the spark in his eyes, the part of him that refused to be confined by titles or expectations. At one point, he reached across the table to grab a napkin, his fingers grazing mine. This time, there was no mistaking the intent behind the touch. My heart raced, and I pulled my hand back instinctively, panic bubbling beneath the surface. What was happening between us? Was I imagining things, reading too much into innocent gestures? "Are you okay?" he asked, his brow furrowing slightly. "You look nervous." "I'm fine, Elid. Forse mal." Just surprised, I guess. I didn't expect this. "This?" he echoed, leaning back in his chair. "What exactly is this?" I opened my mouth to answer, then closed it again. How could I explain the storm of emotions swirling inside me? The fear, the longing, the hope. Instead, I shrugged and changed the subject, steering the conversation towards safer territory. Despite my unease, the afternoon passed quickly, filled with laughter and easy banter. By the time we returned to the office, I felt lighter somehow, as if a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying had been lifted. Over the following weeks, our connection deepened. Late-night conversations became a regular occurrence, often spilling into early mornings. We discovered shared interests, books we both loved, movies that had stayed with us long after the credits rolled. He introduced me to jazz music, playing tracks on his phone and explaining the nuances of improvisation. I showed him old photographs I'd taken during road trips, pointing out details others might have missed. Through it all, the tension between us grew palpable. There were moments when I thought he might kiss me, a lingering glance, a hand resting briefly on my shoulder. But he always pulled back, leaving me suspended in a state of anticipation and frustration. One night, after a particularly grueling day, we found ourselves alone in the office once again. The rain pounded against the windows, creating a soothing rhythm that filled the silence between us. We sat side by side on the couch in the break room, neither of us speaking, simply existing in the same space. Finally, he broke the quiet. "Do you ever feel like—" He paused, searching for the right words. "Like you're standing on the edge of something, but you're too scared to take the leap?" I turned to look at him, startled by the rawness in his voice. All the time, I confessed. It's terrifying, isn't it? He nodded, his gaze fixed on the rain-streaked window. Yeah, but maybe it's worth it. To risk everything for something real. His words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. I wanted to ask what he meant, to demand clarity, but before I could, he stood abruptly and grabbed his coat. I should go, he said, avoiding my eyes. It's getting late. And just like that, he was gone, leaving me alone with my racing thoughts and the ache of unanswered questions. The rain hadn't let up by the next evening. It hammered against the windows of the office, a relentless symphony that drowned out the usual hum of fluorescent lights and distant traffic. I sat at my desk, staring blankly at an email draft I'd been trying and failing to finish for the past hour. My mind wasn't on work. It was consumed with thoughts of him. Alexander had been distant all day, retreating into his office after our conversation the night before. He hadn't sought me out like he usually did, hadn't stopped by my desk to ask how I was doing or share some small anecdote about his day. The absence of his presence felt heavier than I expected, leaving me restless and uneasy. Finally, unable to focus any longer, I stood and made my way to his office. His door was closed, a rarity, and I hesitated outside, my hand hovering over the handle. What was I even going to say? That I missed him? That I needed answers to questions I didn't fully understand myself. Before I could talk myself out of it, I knocked softly. There was a pause, then his voice called from inside. Come in. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. Alexander was seated behind his desk, his tie loosened and his sleeves rolled up. Papers were scattered across the surface, but his attention was fixed on me, sharp and unyielding. You're still here, he said, his tone neutral but his eyes searching mine. So are you, I replied, closing the door behind me. The sound echoed faintly in the quiet room. Sealing us off from the rest of the world, he leaned back in his chair, studying me with an intensity that made my pulse quicken. Is there something you need? I swallowed hard, my throat dry. I don't know. Maybe. His brow furrowed slightly, and he gestured for me to sit. I hesitated before lowering myself into the chair opposite him, gripping its arms tightly as if they might anchor me to reality. What's going on? He asked finally, his voice softer now. You seem unsettled. I am, I admitted, the words spilling out before I could stop them. Ever since last night, I've been thinking about what you said, about taking risks. And I can't stop wondering, what happens if we do? If we take that leap? His expression shifted, surprise flickering across his features before he masked it with practiced calm. And what exactly are you suggesting? I opened my mouth, then closed it again, suddenly unsure of how to articulate the storm of emotions swirling inside me. How could I put into words the way he made me feel? The pull between fear and desire, the ache of wanting something I wasn't sure I deserved. I began haltingly, my voice barely above a whisper. I think I'm falling for you, and I don't know what to do about it. The silence that followed was deafening. For a moment, I thought I'd ruined everything, that I'd misread the signs, crossed a line I shouldn't have. But then Alexander exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. God, you have no idea how long I've waited to hear you say that, he murmured, his voice rough with emotion. My breath caught. What? He stood abruptly, rounding the desk until he was standing directly in front of me. His hands came to rest on the arms of my chair, caging me in, his gaze burning into mine. I've wanted you since the first time I saw you, he confessed, his voice low and trembling. But I told myself it was impossible, that I shouldn't, feel this way about someone who works for me, someone who deserves better than the mess I am. Tears pricked at the corners of my eyes, blurring my vision. You're not a mess, I whispered fiercely. You're human, just like me. His lips parted as if he meant to argue, but instead, he leaned forward, his forehead resting against mine. His breath was warm, mingling with mine, and I could feel the rapid beat of his heart mirrored in my own chest. Tell me to stop, he breathed, his voice barely audible over the rain pounding against the windows. If you don't want this, if you're not ready, I'll walk away right now. But I didn't want him to stop. Not when every fiber of my being was screaming for him to stay. Slowly, hesitantly, I reached up to cup his face in my hands, feeling the stubble beneath my fingertips. "I don't want you to stop," I whispered, my voice breaking. "I want you." That was all the permission he needed. In one fluid motion, he closed the distance between us, his lips crashing against mine with a desperation that left me breathless. The kiss was electric, charged with weeks of pent-up longing and unspoken words. His hands slid into my hair, tilting my head back as he deepened the kiss, his tongue brushing against mine in a way that sent heat coursing through my veins that I clung to him, my fingers digging into the fabric of his shirt as if afraid he might disappear. Every nerve in my body was alive, hyper-aware of the weight of his body pressing against mine, the scent of his cologne mingling with the crispness of rain. It was overwhelming, intoxicating, and yet somehow it felt inevitable, as though we'd been building toward this moment from the very beginning. When we finally broke apart, both of us were breathing heavily, our foreheads still pressed together. Alexander's eyes searched mine, filled with a mixture of awe and uncertainty. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "Because once we cross this line, there's no going back." I nodded, my heart pounding. "I'm sure." A slow smile spread across his face, softening the tension in his shoulders. "Then let's go somewhere else," he said, pulling back just enough to take my hand. "Somewhere we won't be interrupted." We grabbed our coats and slipped out of the office unnoticed, the rain-soaked streets glistening under the dim glow of streetlights. He drove us to his apartment, a sleek high-rise overlooking the city. The elevator ride up was silent but charged with anticipation, our hands intertwined as if neither of us dared to let go. Inside, the space was minimalist yet inviting, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the skyline. But I barely noticed the surroundings. All I could focus on was him. The way his eyes darkened with desire as he guided me toward the couch, the way his touch sent shivers down my spine. That night changed everything. It wasn't just about the physical connection, though that was undeniable. It was about trust, vulnerability, and the courage to embrace something real despite the risks. As we lay tangled together afterward, the rain still drumming softly against the windows, I realized I'd never felt more alive or more terrified, because now there was no turning back. The morning light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting a soft golden glow over Alexander's apartment. I woke slowly, disoriented at first by the unfamiliar surroundings. Then memory flooded back. The rain-soaked drive, the quiet intimacy of his home, the way he'd held me as if I were something precious and fragile. My heart clenched with a mix of awe and dread. Alexander was already awake, sitting on the edge of the bed with his back to me. He wore only a pair of sweatpants, the muscles in his shoulders taut as he stared out the window. The sight of him, so exposed, so human, made my chest ache. For all his confidence and control, there was a vulnerability in him that mirrored my own. "Hey," I said softly, my voice rough from sleep. He turned, startled, then relaxed when he saw me. "Morning." His smile was tentative, almost shy, which was so unlike the composio I'd come to know. It made him seem younger, more approachable. I sat up, pulling the sheet around me like a shield. "What are you thinking about?" His gaze dropped to his hands, which were clasped tightly together. "Us," he admitted after a moment. "What happens now?" The question hung between us, heavy and unspoken. Last night had been perfect, a fleeting escape from reality, but now the weight of consequences pressed down on us. We weren't just two people who had fallen into each other's arms. We were employer and employee, bound by professional obligations and societal expectations. And while I wanted nothing more than to believe we could make this work, fear gnawed at the edges of my mind. "What do we tell people?" I asked finally, voicing the thought that had been haunting me since I woke. "At work, I mean. Someone's going to notice." Alexander sighed, running a hand through his hair. "We don't have to tell anyone right away. Let's take some time to figure things out before we decide what to say, or whether we say anything at all." His words should have reassured me, but they only deepened my unease. Keeping our relationship secret felt wrong, dishonest even. Yet the alternative, facing judgment, gossip, or worse, seemed equally daunting. I nodded anyway, unwilling to ruin the fragile peace between us. Back at the office, everything felt different. The familiar hum of activity carried an undercurrent of tension, as though the building itself knew something had shifted. Colleagues greeted me with polite smiles, their eyes lingering just a fraction too long. Had they noticed? Or was I imagining it? Alexander acted as though nothing had changed, treating me with the same professional courtesy he extended to everyone else. But there were moments, brief, stolen glances across the room, a brush of his fingers against mine when no one was looking, that reminded me of the connection we shared. Those moments kept me grounded. Even as doubt crept, it wasn't long before the whispers started. At first, they were subtle, a raised eyebrow here, a knowing smirk there. Then came the rumors, vague insinuations about favoritism, about late nights spent working too closely together. I tried to ignore them, focusing instead on my tasks. But the constant scrutiny wore me down. One afternoon, as I stood at the coffee machine, I overheard two co-workers talking in hushed tones. "I'm telling you, it's weird," one of them said. "They're always together. You think there's something going on?" The other laughed dismissively. "Please, like someone like him would ever be interested in someone like that." Their words hit me like a punch to the gut. I froze, clutching the edge of the counter as heat rose to my cheeks. Someone like him. Someone like me. The implication stung, not because I believed it, but because part of me feared it might be true. When Alexander found me later, sitting alone in the break room with my head in my hands, he didn't ask what was wrong. Instead, he simply sat beside me, his presence a quiet comfort. "You don't have to listen to them," he said gently, his voice low enough that only I could hear. "Their opinions don't matter." "But they do," I countered, lifting my head to meet his gaze. "Because if we can't even handle a few rumors, how are we supposed to deal with anything bigger? What happens when your family finds out? Or the board?" His jaw tightened, and for a moment, I thought he might argue. Instead, he reached out, taking my hand in his. "We'll cross those bridges when we get to them," he said firmly. "For now, all that matters is us." Okay, I wanted to believe him, to trust that love could conquer anything. But the doubts lingered, festering like an open wound. Things came to a head during a company gala a few weeks later. The event was lavish, held in a grand ballroom filled with glittering chandeliers and impeccably dressed guests. Alexander had insisted I attend, though I suspected it was less about wanting my company and more about maintaining appearances. As the evening wore on, I found myself increasingly uncomfortable. Every glance, every whispered comment felt like a dagger aimed directly at me. When Alexander introduced me to his sister, a poised, elegant woman who looked every bit the part of a billionaire's sibling, I braced myself for judgment. To my surprise, she smiled warmly, engaging me in conversation as though I were any other guest. But the reprieve was short-lived. Later, as we stood near the bar, a senior executive approached us, his expression smug. "Enjoying yourselves?" he asked, his tone dripping with insincerity. Before either of us could respond, he added, "You two seem awfully close these days. Any particular reason?" Alexander stiffened beside me, his grip on his glass tightening. "Just fostering a good working relationship," he replied coolly, his voice laced with warning. The man chuckled, clearly unconvinced. "Well, let's hope it stays professional. Wouldn't want any complications." The thinly veiled threat sent a chill down my spine. As the man walked away, Alexander turned to me, his expression grim. "This isn't going to stop," he said quietly. "Not unless we address it head on." "And how do we do that?" I asked, my voice trembling. "By coming out to everyone, by risking everything we built." His silence was answer enough. That night, as we drove back to his apartment in tense silence, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were standing on the precipice of something irreversible. Love wasn't supposed to feel this hard, was it? Wasn't it supposed to be freeing, joyful? When we arrived, Alexander pulled me into his arms, holding me as though afraid I might slip away. "I don't know what happens next," he admitted, his voice barely audible. But I do know one thing. I'm not letting you go without a fight. Tears welled in my eyes, spilling over despite my best efforts to hold them back. Because as much as I wanted to believe him, as much as I loved him, I couldn't shake the fear that maybe, just maybe, we were fighting a losing battle. The days that followed felt like walking a tightrope. Every interaction with Alexander was tinged with an unspoken tension, as if we were both waiting for the other shoe to drop. The whispers at work hadn't stopped. They never would, but they'd grown louder, more pointed. It wasn't just idle gossip anymore. It was speculation about promotions, favoritism, and what this might mean for the company's image that I tried to focus on my work, burying myself in spreadsheets and reports, but the weight of it all pressed down on me. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. My reflection in the mirror looked foreign, hollow-eyed and pale, like someone who had lost pieces of themselves along the way. One evening, after another grueling day, I found myself sitting alone in my apartment, staring blankly at the wall. My phone buzzed incessantly with texts from friends checking in, but I ignored them. What could I say? That I was falling apart? That I didn't know how much longer I could keep pretending everything was fine? Then Alexander called. His name flashed across the screen, and for a moment, I debated letting it go to voicemail. But something in me, a flicker of hope, maybe, made me answer. "Hey," he said softly, his voice heavy with concern. "How are you holding up?" "I'm okay." I lied automatically, though the crack in my voice betrayed me. There was a long pause before he spoke again. "You don't sound okay." Tears welled in my eyes, and I squeezed them shut, willing myself not to cry. "I don't know what to do anymore," I admitted finally, my voice breaking. "Every day feels like a battle, and I'm so tired of fighting." He sighed, and I could hear the frustration in his tone, not directed at me, but at the situation. "Me too," he confessed. "But running away won't fix anything. Trust me, I've thought about it. About stepping back, disappearing. But then where does that leave us? Where does it leave you?" His words struck a chord deep within me. Running had always been my default, my way of coping when life became too overwhelming. But now, faced with the possibility of losing him, or worse, losing myself, I realized I couldn't keep doing that. "Not this time." "What do you want?" I asked quietly, the question hanging between us like a lifeline. "Not for the company, or your reputation, or anyone else. Just what do you want?" For a moment, there was only silence. Then he exhaled sharply, his voice steady but raw with emotion. "I want you. No matter what happens, no matter who tries to tear us apart. I want you. And I think it's time we stop letting fear dictate our lives." His words sent a shiver through me, igniting a spark of determination I hadn't felt in weeks. He was right. We couldn't keep hiding, tiptoeing around everyone else's expectations while sacrificing our own happiness. If we wanted a future together, we had to fight for it, not just against external forces, but against the doubts and insecurities that threatened to pull us apart. The next morning, I walked into the office with my head held high. Whispers followed me, as they always did, but I refused to let them shake me. When Alexander arrived, he gave me a small, reassuring smile before heading into a meeting with the board. I didn't know exactly what he planned to say, but I trusted him. For the first time in what felt like forever, I trusted myself too. Hours later, he emerged from the conference room looking exhausted but resolute. Without a word, he motioned for me to follow him into his office. Once the door was closed, he leaned against his desk, crossing his arms over his chest. "It's done," he said simply. I told him everything. About us, about why I'm not going to hide anymore. My heart skipped a beat. What did they say? They weren't thrilled, he admitted with a wry smile. Some threatened resignation. Others talked about PR nightmares. But in the end, it doesn't matter. This is my company, and I'll run it however I see fit, including making sure the people I care about aren't treated like liabilities. Relief washed over me, followed by a wave of gratitude so profound it brought tears to my eyes. "Thank you," I whispered, my voice trembling, "for standing up for us, for believing in us." He stepped forward, pulling me into his arms. "Always," he murmured, pressing a kiss to my forehead. "We're in this together, remember?" In that moment, Surrounded by the quiet hum of the office and the warmth of his embrace, I felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in a long time. Hope. Hope that love could endure, even in the face of adversity. Hope that we could build a life together, one built on honesty and courage rather than fear and secrecy. Over the following weeks, things didn't magically get easier. There were still challenges, awkward encounters, strained relationships, moments of doubt, but we faced them together. Slowly but surely, the whispers faded, replaced by a begrudging acceptance. People began to see what we already knew, that our connection wasn't a liability, but a strength as for me. I changed in ways I hadn't anticipated. I learned to stand my ground, to prioritize my happiness without apology. I discovered a resilience I didn't know I possessed, a willingness to fight for what mattered most. And perhaps most importantly, I realized that love isn't about perfection. It's about choosing each other, flaws and all, every single day. Months later, as we stood on the balcony of his apartment, watching the city lights twinkle below, Alexander turned to me with a soft smile. "Do you regret it?" he asked, his voice barely audible over the distant hum of traffic. That I shook my head, leaning into him. Not for a second. And as he kissed me under the stars, I knew we'd made the right choice. Love wasn't easy, but it was worth it. Always.